So, thanks everyone for tuning in. This is obviously breaking news. We're trying to use the power of Substack to explain it. So, I think most of you probably have been following the Kilmar Abrego case. I know we've been covering it quite a bit on Cafe, but just to remind people of the sequence here, I'm going to try not to shake my phone. Just to remind people, hold on, of the sequence. So Kilmar Abrego Garcia was one of the individuals who was deported by the Trump administration when, a month or two ago, they were doing these mass deportations primarily focused on Venezuelans. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was deported to El Salvador. Now, that was improper because Abrego Garcia had this thing called a holding order in effect, put in effect by the courts. Basically, the immigration courts had decided that he was here illegally. So he was subject to deportation, but they said not to El Salvador. Now, why does that happen? Because there was a determination made that he would face danger. A little unclear why exactly. Retribution, I think, from a gang or a rival gang or something that was apparently shaking down Kilmar Abrego Garcia's mother's. I think it was a food stand. They sold, I forget the name of the food, but like a food cart or something. Whatever the reason, good or bad, there was an order saying he is not to be deported to El Salvador. Guess what the administration did? They deported him to El Salvador. Now, in the initial court appearances over that, the DOJ admitted that it was a mistake. They called it an error, clerical error or something or other, and yet they would not bring him back. The case went up and down the courts. It ends up at the U.S. Supreme Court, which says you have to, hold on, facilitate his return. The lower court had said you have to effectuate his return. What's the difference? Effectuate means make it happen. Facilitate means try, or to quote Bart Simpson, try to try. The Supreme Court said you have to facilitate his return, but the Supreme Court said we're not going to order you to do some specific thing because it has to do with foreign diplomacy, foreign affairs. That's not really for us. The Trump administration proceeded to barely try. I mean, they did next to nothing. They claimed they couldn't get him back. Of course they could, as we now know. But they said, well, facilitate is a very broad word, and if he does show up here, we'll send. If El Salvador does release him, we'll send a plane. It looked like nothing was going to happen. I think I did write about this for Cafe. I said there's a chance this just ends up in sort of purgatory. Instead, what has now happened is we have this indictment, which I printed out here. So Kilmar Abrego Garcia has now been charged with a criminal offense, and he's being brought back. And as I just said on air on CNN to Jake Tapper, this is backwards. If you have a known or suspected criminal who's here illegally, you arrest and prosecute that person first, and then they serve their time, and then you deport them. Here, he was deported. There was all this controversy. Weeks later, they say, oh, actually, we're going to indict him. Now we're going to bring him back, prosecute him. He'll do his jail time, assuming he's convicted, and then we'll redeport him. So, look, there's more reporting that others will do about why it played out this way, but it seems pretty clear that this was an out of sorts for DOJ and the government. They could say, oh, well, he's a criminal anyway, and so let's call the whole thing off. So that's why there's nothing illegal, by the way, about doing it this way, but it is unusual, and I think it does speak to the fact that this is a way out for DOJ from this mess. And I see so many of your questions. I wish I could answer them, but I will try to answer them at the end if I can. Okay. The indictment itself. So there's all sorts of sort of sensational allegations in here, but the key thing to know is the actual charges are really simple. He's not charged with human trafficking per se. He's charged with simply, well, I guess human trafficking is a very broad term. He's charged with simply transporting illegal aliens over state lines. You could call that human trafficking, but often human trafficking, as I always use it, meant there's an element of force or coercion, although there is some of that hinted at or alleged in here. All that the prosecutors are going to have to show here is two things. One, Abrego Garcia knew the people he was driving were here illegally, and two, that he crossed the state line. That said, the allegation is that he was part of a decade-long, from 2016 to 25, organized international ring. What they would do is they would smuggle people into the United States over the southern border, and then Abrego Garcia would drive them in large groups, 7, 8, 9 people at a time, up to wherever they were headed, and he would get paid. Let me just share some of the details in this indictment so you have a better sense of what it was. It says that he worked with at least 6 other co-conspirators. It does indict that it does allege that he was a member of MS-13. It's a little non-specific in how they know that. They say, well, he was treated differently than some of the other drivers, and they would drive MS-13 other members. So maybe he's an associate of MS-13. It's a little hard to know exactly. But it is alleged that he's part of MS-13, that he drove thousands of undocumented aliens, many of whom were MS-13 members and associates. They mentioned CC 1 through 6. CC means co-conspirator. Some of them are clearly talking to the government. They expect to use them as cooperating witnesses. The indictment also alleges that he would pick up the undocumented aliens in the Houston area, drive them north. There are some sensational allegations in here about firearms, about drugs, and about assault. But none of those things are actually charged in the indictment. Why? First of all, some of that's not really a federal crime. I mean, just assault in itself is not a federal crime. But I think what happened here is the evidence sometimes when you're a prosecutor falls in the sort of middle ground where you have some evidence of a thing. A witness will have testified to you or in the grand jury, yeah, there were times we moved drugs or guns, but you don't have enough to charge it. You don't have the guns. You don't have the drugs. You don't have to, but maybe you have one witness instead of two witnesses. So these are things that are alleged in the indictment, but not actually charged. There's nothing necessarily improper about doing that. But as a prosecutor, you're not really supposed to lay on tons of inflammatory details that are not directly relevant to the charge. But honestly, you would in this case. If there were allegations of guns and drugs, you probably would put them in there. So those are the basic charges here. Pam Bondi took to the podium today and gave a press conference. That to me sort of gives away what the motive is here. Look, I think this is a valid indictment. I think he's virtually certain to get convicted and to do jail time. But to have the Attorney General of the United States and the Deputy AG, Todd Blanche, stand up and give a presser about this tells you that they understand how politically charged this has gotten. If this was not Kilmar, Abrego, Garcia, this would be a not a nothing, I don't want to minimize it, but it would be a run-of-the-mill federal case involving transport of illegal aliens. It would be assigned to a fairly junior unit in the offices I worked at. It wouldn't go to the big heavy hitters, the bosses and the supervisors. It would go to maybe even what we would call the general crimes unit, which was the first years. And it would certainly not merit a press release, an announcement by the U.S. attorney, or definitely an announcement by the AG. So, look, they're aware that there's a spotlight on this. And I think a lot of what you're going to hear, probably happening now on cable news, is victory dance from Republicans who say, see, see, see. But it doesn't really address the fact that he was improperly deported and then DOJ more or less ignored or slow played the order to facilitate his return. I think Democrats made a tactical mistake here. And I said this, I'm sure I said this in Cafe at some point. But, Democrats, I think, should have played it differently. Instead of trying to paint him as this good guy, they don't know. Why is Van Hollen going down there? There was a representative from Maryland, and they're all sort of stammering now. Democrats didn't have to say any of that. What Democrats should have said is, if I was advising them, I would have said, your position should be, we don't know what this guy is. We don't care what he is. Maybe he's good, maybe he's bad, but it's about due process. There's people charged with horrible crimes every day in this country. They still get due process. That's what this is about. So that's what I would have done rather than trying to embrace him and Van Hollen going down and sitting with him and trying to turn him into some kind of hero. I see people saying, how do we know or how can we trust the evidence in here? Same way we would test it in any case. One of two things are going to happen. Either he's going to plead guilty or they're going to go to trial. If they go to trial, then the evidence will be tested in a court of law and prosecutors will have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. One more thing before I take some of your questions, again, if I can see them sort of flipping by, is what's going to happen next? Well, he'll be prosecuted. I think if I had to guess, he'll probably plead guilty. The evidence seems, the crime is so easy to prove. 95+% of all federal cases do plead guilty. If he goes to trial, it'll be in Tennessee, in federal court in Tennessee. That's where he's being held. Why Tennessee, by the way? I'm sure some of you are wondering. This is alleged to be a conspiracy that stretched across the United States. One of the great advantages prosecutors have, federal prosecutors, I used to take advantage of this. It is federal. I see a question there. Is if you have a conspiracy, you can charge that conspiracy in any district where it happened. So if you have a conspiracy that stretches from Texas all the way to Maryland, you can charge any of the states that you knew, any of the federal districts that you could prove he was in as part of the conspiracy. We know that there was a traffic stop in Tennessee where he had 8 people in the car or something. So this case will be played out in Tennessee. If he either pleads guilty or is convicted at trial, he will then do his jail time. It looks to me, it's hard to know, looks to me like a few year case, 2, 3, 4 year case, not a 20-year case. And then he'll serve his time, whatever it is. And, or even if he's acquitted, he will then be deported. And what'll happen, Pam Bondi said, we're going to send him right back to El Salvador. I thought that was strange because it's the one country they're not currently allowed to send him to. One of two things will happen. Either they will seek to remove that order that prevents his deportation to El Salvador. You can, I guess, go back. You can go back to the immigration courts and say, hey, things have changed. We'd like to deport, Your Honor, we believe things have changed and this order should be lifted. We should be able to send him back to El Salvador. Or they could send him to a different country. You don't have to send a person back to their country of citizenship. You just have to send them somewhere where they're not going to be in danger, basically. So Kilmar Abrego Garcia is going to be prosecuted. He will probably be imprisoned. He will almost certainly then be deported. So look, the most important thing I would say is we need to keep distinction between this indictment, which doesn't strike me as invalid on its face, but also it doesn't answer the political problems that have been raised here. And it doesn't answer the problems with the fact that he was improperly deported and then the administration refused to fully facilitate his return. Did they facilitate? Maybe on some construction of the word. So those are two separate things that I think we need to keep separate. I'm sure that Republicans, like I said, are going to be on cable news tonight and saying, haha, see, we told you so. I don't know what Democrats are going to say. I saw, again, I forget his name, but he's the House of Representatives rep from Maryland from this district. And he was on right when this happened and he was sort of stammering and he didn't have a good, but again, Dems all along sort of said, I don't care who this guy is. I don't know if he's good or bad. It doesn't matter. Due process. Okay. Let me try to catch some of your questions. They're flying by. Okay. I wish I could scroll. Can I scroll? Oh, I can. Look at that. I'm learning. CCOT. What about the rest of the prisoners at CCOT? Yeah, good question. I mean, they do have the right to challenge through a process called habeas their imprisonment at CCOT, but it's hard to do that. And I don't think we've really seen too many of them. The fact of the matter is, look, and I've written about this. You all know if you follow my stuff on Cafe, the way the administration has gone about these deportations has been crazy and overly complex and at times inappropriate and at times self-defeating. But it's kind of easy. It's real easy to deport someone who's here illegally through just the normal channel. So ultimately, that's sort of a fallback available to the administration. Okay, let me see some other questions here. Oop. All the commentary I heard was not, oh, the guy is innocent. It was about due process. Yeah, I mean, that's fair. Linnea Folger. Some of the commentary was, a lot of the commentary was due process, but Democrats did end up going down this road where, like it or not, they were painted as at least embracing the guy. And so I think that part of it was a mistake. About time for due process to play out. Okay, could there be a charge? Could the charge be a ruse to save face? I'm going to end with that one. I think it's a good question. It's not a ruse. It's a legitimate charge. The evidence seems to match the charge. But yes, to save face, 100%. So I would say the indictment is not a ruse, but it is intended to save face if you look at the sequencing of all this. Okay, folks, I said that I would do this in 8 to 10 minutes. So now we are at 15 minutes. So I guess we're good. Thank you, everyone. Wow, good showing for no notice on a Friday afternoon. I appreciate it. These are fun. Try to keep on that. We will keep on this at Cafe and have a good weekend, everyone. How do I end this? There we go.